You don't survive this city by opening your door to strangers. But when the knock came at 1 in the afternoon, heavy and unhurried against the steel door of her basement room, Maren Quill didn't have a choice. She looked through the gap and saw a pair of leather shoes worth more than a year of her rent. The man wasn't a cop. Cops knock 3 times and announce themselves. This one just stood there, hands in his pockets, like he had all afternoon to wait, and like the whole building already belonged to him. 13 hours earlier, at 4 in the morning, Maren had been wiping down the lobby glass of the Ashcroft building, the rag in her hand gone gray from chemicals. Outside, the rain slashed sideways through the streetlights. Then she saw her, a white-haired woman, soaked through, 1 foot bare, knocking on a glass door that had been locked since midnight. She wasn't calling for help. She just kept knocking, steady and patient, like someone afraid of being late for work. Maren knew she was supposed to call security. She knew every rule in the company handbook. She knew exactly what opening that door would cost her. But she had seen that look before 4 years of it, every single day, in a small room on the other side of the city. She set the rag down. She walked over and turned the lock. 48 hours later, she would lose her job, lose her home, and have 2 armed men looking for her. But right then, Maren just took a breath and pulled the door open. If this story touched you, leave a like so we know. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The cold air rushed in with her. The old woman stepped across the threshold, her body trembling in waves, rainwater streaming from her hair and shoulders in long trails across the granite floor. Maren herself had finished mopping only 2 hours earlier. She didn't look around. She didn't ask where she was. She only said, in the hurried, anxious voice of someone explaining herself to a superior, that she was already late, that the dress shop opened at 7 o'clock, that Mrs. Halloran would be terribly angry, and that there were 3 wedding gowns due back to customers that very day. The dress shop on Halbrook Street. She repeated the name twice, clearly and with absolute certainty, as though it were the only thing left in the world that still stood firm. Maren said nothing. She didn't stop to ask herself what she was doing. She pulled the plastic chair from the corner of the lobby into the pool of light beneath the ceiling lamp, helped the old woman sit down, then lowered herself onto one knee in front of her. The woman's bare feet were ice cold and streaked with mud, and her toes had already begun to turn purple. Maren pulled the entire stack of paper towels from her cleaning cart and dried the spaces between each toe, then took off her own coat and wrapped it around both feet. She lifted the woman's wrist, placed 2 fingers in exactly the right place, and counted silently. The pulse was fast and weak, but steady. There was no sign of immediate danger. She checked the back of the woman's head and both temples, gently and efficiently, without a single unnecessary movement. Then she went to the corner of the room where the cleaning crew kept the hot water dispenser and made a cup of tea with one of the cheap tea bags everyone on the crew used, cooling it by pouring it back and forth between 2 paper cups. When she handed it to the woman, she didn't place the cup in the center of her palm. She tilted it so the woman's thumb could catch the rim, then folded the remaining fingers around the cup and kept her own hand underneath for another 3 seconds to make certain it was secure. The old woman was able to drink. She didn't spill a single drop. No one had ever taught Maren how to do any of those things. She hadn't even thought about them while she was doing them. They simply flowed from her hands, smooth and precise, like a song whose words someone believed they had forgotten, yet their mouth still knew how to sing. Outside, the rain continued to lash sideways through the streetlights. Inside the lobby, there was only the low hum of the air conditioner and the sound of the old woman blowing across the surface of her tea. Maren looked at the handbag clutched in the woman's lap. It was old, its leather strap cracked with age, but it had once been expensive, the kind of expensive that belonged to a time long gone. Maren sat down on the floor beside her feet. "May I look inside your bag for a moment? I'm trying to find a telephone number for your family." The old woman lowered her eyes toward her, her gaze unfocused, as though she were looking straight through Maren. Then she held out the bag. Maren opened it. It was almost completely empty. No wallet, no cards, no keys, not a single form of identification. There was only a plastic comb with broken teeth, a tube of lipstick worn down to almost nothing, and an old photograph with frayed edges and yellow stains in all 4 corners. The moment Maren touched the photograph, the old woman lunged forward so quickly that Maren flinched. She snatched it away and pressed it to her chest, covering it with both hands as her body folded around it, shielding it as though it were something alive. "You mustn't look at this." Her voice had hardened, suddenly, and strangely clear. Marin withdrew her hand at once. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. I won't look." The old woman remained in that position for a long while before slowly relaxing, though her hand never left the photograph. Marin looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4:20. Her shift still had nearly 2 hours left. The camera in this lobby recorded 24 hours a day. She had personally inserted the key into a lock that every rule in the company handbook forbade her from touching. "Ma'am," she said, making her voice as gentle as she could, "let me call the police. They'll be able to find your family faster than anyone else." The reaction came at once, and there was nothing confused or distant about it. The old woman seized Marin's sleeve with such force that her fingernails pressed through the fabric. Her body began to shake, but no longer from the cold. "Don't call them," she said, and her voice broke apart. "Please, don't call them. They'll lock me away. They locked me in a room last time and wouldn't let me leave. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm only going to work." Marin felt something tighten inside her chest. She had heard those words before. Not the words themselves, but the fear beneath them. The fear of someone who knew the world was slowly taking away her right to decide for herself, one small piece at a time, a little more each day, with no way to stop it. "All right." Marin placed her hand over the one gripping her sleeve. "I won't call them. I promise." The old woman studied her, searching Marin's face for something, and only then did she let go. Marin picked up the handbag again. She turned it upside down and shook it. And when nothing else fell out, she ran her fingers along the seams inside. The lining had come loose in one corner. Her fingertip touched something hard and thin trapped between the 2 layers of fabric. She pulled it free. It was a piece of paper folded into quarters, its edges crushed and worn from having been opened and folded again countless times. Inside was a single line written in ink, in the bold, decisive handwriting of a man. "Number 9, Renmore Road." Marin stared at the words for a long time. She knew Renmore. Everyone who lived in the city knew Renmore. It was the only road leading up into the northern hills, where the houses displayed no numbers outside their gates, where no one was ever seen walking, and where someone like her could live an entire lifetime without ever having a reason to set foot. She folded the paper again, looked down at the old woman sitting there with the photograph pressed to her chest beneath Marin's coat, then turned toward the glass doors and the curtain of rain beyond them. The company van was parked by the rear entrance, where the cleaning crew kept its equipment. Marin knew exactly what she was doing when she took the ring of keys from the wooden box on the wall. Her shift still had 1 hour and 40 minutes left. On the assignment board, the 9th and 10th floors were still blank, with no one's signature beside them. She wrote 3 words in the handover log: "Family emergency," then closed the book. She helped the old woman through the back door, opened the van, lowered the seat 1 notch so she could lean back more comfortably, and turned the heat as high as it would go before fastening the seatbelt around her. Marin's coat was still wrapped around the woman's feet. Marin herself had nothing left but her thin uniform shirt. When the van rolled out of the lot, the dashboard clock read 4:38, and the city beyond the windshield had become nothing but blurred ribbons of light beneath the rain. About 5 minutes later, the old woman turned toward her. "I'm Bertie," she said clearly, as though introducing herself at a party. "People have called me that since I was a tiny little girl. No one ever uses my real name, not even my mother." Marin smiled without taking her eyes off the road. "I'm Marin. I know that, Colleen." She gave the back of Marin's hand a gentle pat where it rested on the gearshift. "You always say that." Marin didn't correct her. She simply let her hand remain still beneath the old woman's for another moment. It happened 4 more times during the drive. Sometimes she was Colleen. Sometimes Bertie called her only the girl. Then Bertie asked, "What time is it, dear?" "Almost 5 o'clock. "Oh, Lord." She lifted a hand and hurriedly smoothed her hair. "Mrs. Halloran is going to be terribly angry. 3 wedding gowns, 3 of them, and I still haven't finished a single neckline. Don't worry, I'll explain it to her for you." The old woman nodded, reassured. She looked out the window for perhaps 2 minutes, then turned back. "What time is it, dear?" "Almost 5 o'clock. Marin answered in exactly the same voice she had used the first time, not one beat faster, without the slightest trace of impatience bleeding into the end of the sentence. "Oh, Lord, Mrs. Halloran is going to be terribly angry. Don't worry, I'll explain it to her for you." The third time, Bertie asked while the van was crossing an overpass, and Marin gave her the same answer, word for word, as though it were the first time in her life she had ever heard the question. because for Bertie, it was the first time. Over 4 long years, Maren had learned that lesson, first by getting it wrong, and only afterward by learning how to get it right. Through evenings, when she had answered in a tired voice, and then watched Ruth Ann shrink into herself in her chair, remaining silent for 2 hours, because she knew she had bothered someone, but couldn't understand why. The cost of 1 second's impatience was always far greater than the effort of repeating an answer. The van left downtown behind, and the streetlights grew farther apart. Then, without warning, Bertie's voice changed. It dropped lower and slowed, and every trace of confusion vanished from it like mist burning away. 1974 was a hard year, she said. Do you know the basement beneath the shop? The one where they stored the fabric? Maren glanced at her. The woman beside her was sitting upright now, both hands resting neatly on her handbag, her eyes fixed straight ahead, and in the faint glow of the dashboard, her face appeared 10 years younger. I've never been down there. No one goes down there. It's damp, and there are rats. But I went down every day. I told everyone I was taking inventory of the fabric. She gave a quiet laugh, brief and sharp. There's a 4th floorboard from the eastern wall. Count inward from the wall. 1, 2, 3, 4. It isn't nailed down. It only lies there, and for over 50 years no one has ever bothered to count. Maren kept both hands on the steering wheel and her eyes on the road. She had heard hundreds of stories like this before. Ruth Ann had once told her about a train to Chicago she had never taken and a younger brother she had never had. You didn't argue with stories like those. You sat and listened. What's beneath the floorboard? Books, Bertie said. The numbers. All the numbers. What kind of numbers? They're numbers. Whose else would they be? Money coming in. Money going out. Who received it? Who paid it? Which day? Which dock? Her voice remained as calm as though she were describing how to sew on a button. But I didn't write the way other people wrote. I wrote in my own way. I used my mother's birthday as the base. Then I reversed it. Then I added the clothing measurements of each person on the list. I did it that way for 10 years. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Colleen? No, ma'am, Maren answered honestly. I don't. That's all right. No one does. The old woman turned toward her, and for the first time during the entire drive, she looked directly into Maren's face. That was the beauty of it. My husband held that ledger in his hands 3 times, opened it, looked through it, and handed it back to me. He said it looked like a fabric record. He truly believed it was nothing more than a fabric record. She laughed again, and within that laugh was something Maren couldn't name, an old pride that had been buried for far too long beneath more than 50 years of dust. I was better at it than anyone, better than all of them. The only trouble was that no one believed a wife knew how to count. The van passed the sign marking the turn toward the northern hills. Maren nodded and made a quiet sound of agreement to please her, then switched on the turn signal. At that moment, only 3 thoughts occupied her mind: that the road up the hill would be slippery at this hour, that she needed to return the van to the depot before 6 o'clock, and that the feet of the woman beside her were still cold. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. Bertie rested her head against the window, closed her eyes, and in less than a minute, the woman from 1974 disappeared completely. When she opened her eyes again on the next stretch of road, she looked around the van with the mild surprise of someone who had just entered an unfamiliar room, then asked Maren what time it was and whether she was late for work. Maren answered as though it were the first time. The road climbing the hill was narrower than Maren had imagined, bordered on both sides by towering oak trees that still released waves of rainwater onto the roof of the van long after the storm had stopped. None of the houses displayed a number. None of the mailboxes bore a name. She had to slow down until the van was almost crawling, leaning forward to study every stone pillar along the roadside, until the headlights swept across a bronze number 9 set deep into a wall, so small that one blink would have been enough to miss it. Behind the wall stood an iron gate nearly 13 feet high, its vertical bars as thick as a man's wrist, and beyond it lay the darkness of a long drive leading toward a house from which only 3 illuminated windows could be seen. Maren pulled over close to the gate and lowered her window. An intercom box was mounted on the stone pillar, its metal face dull and unyielding, with no screen and only a single button. She pressed it. There was no chime. No burst of static. Nothing at all. She waited 20 seconds, then pressed it again and held it longer. Still nothing. Beside her, Bertie had fallen asleep, her head tilted to one side, both hands still wrapped around the handbag in her lap. Marin looked up. A camera was mounted at the upper right corner of the stone pillar, its indicator glowing red, its lens aimed directly at her face. She pressed the button a third time. No one answered. A chill moved down her spine, and it had nothing to do with the rain. In a house like this, when someone had been missing through half the night, and the gate bell had been pressed 3 times without a response, there could be only 2 possibilities. Either no one remained inside, or everyone inside was occupied with something more important than the gate. Marin looked at the clock. It was 5:29. She had 31 minutes left to return to the depot. She considered taking the old woman to a hospital, but the hospital would call the police, and she had made a promise. She considered leaving her seated outside the gate, then brushed the thought from her mind as quickly as she would have brushed away an insect. At last she shifted into reverse, turned to look behind her, and began backing up so she could turn the van around on the narrow road. She had moved barely 10 feet when both sides of the vehicle suddenly flooded with light. 2 flashlight beams, so powerful they turned everything white, swept across the windshield and locked onto her face. Marin stepped on the brake. 2 men emerged from the trees, one from the right and one from the left, moving quickly without running, each with one hand inside his coat. The man on the left reached her first and struck the window with his open palm. "Turn off the engine. Put both hands on the steering wheel." Marin turned off the engine. She placed both hands on the wheel. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The driver's door was pulled open from the outside. A hand closed around her arm, not roughly, but with no room for negotiation, and she was taken out of the seat. She managed to say that there was an old woman inside the van, that she was asleep, and that they shouldn't frighten her. The man on the right had already opened the passenger door and leaned inside. He looked up sharply and spoke a few brief words into the radio clipped to his collar. After that, everything happened very quickly. The iron gate began sliding open, silent and heavy. 3 more people ran out from the grounds. Marin was led through a narrow door beside the stone pillar and into a square room, measuring only about 108 square feet. The walls were bare. There was a long table, 3 monitors displaying feeds from across the property, and a white light mounted directly to the ceiling that illuminated every corner and left nowhere for shadows to gather. There was no chair for her. She stood in the middle of the room, still wet, her hands clasped in front of her stomach, while 4 people watched her. The woman asking the questions appeared to be in her late 40s. Her hair was tied low, her black coat buttoned all the way to the throat, and her face showed no expression at all. She didn't introduce herself. Only later would Marin learn that her name was Teddy Kane. Name: Marin Quill. Spell it. Marin spelled it. Occupation: I clean offices. Brightline Company. I work the night shift at the Ashcroft building. Whose vehicle? The company's. I borrowed it. Who authorized you to borrow it? Marin swallowed. No one, ma'am. Teddy wrote something in a small notebook. Who told you to bring her here? No one told me. I found the address in her bag. Who gave you the paper? No one gave it to me. It was caught inside the lining. I had to reach between the layers to pull it out. The questions continued with the same steady rhythm. No one raised a voice. No one made a threat. That was precisely what made them frightening. They asked where she lived, and Marin answered, 28 Fenmore Street, the basement apartment, down the stairs along the side of the building, with no doorbell. They asked who lived with her, and she said she lived alone. They asked whether she had called anyone that night, whether she had sent anyone a message, whether she had taken any photographs, and she handed over her telephone for them to examine. She answered every question without concealing a single word, because she was afraid, and because in 28 years of living she had learned that when people questioned you in that tone, honesty was the shortest road out of the room. While this was happening, an older man approached from the house and stopped in the doorway. He was about 60, with neatly combed silver hair, spectacles resting low on the bridge of his nose, and a soft leather bag of the kind doctors once carried hanging from one hand. He didn't step fully inside. He didn't ask a single question. He merely stood there and listened to everything, watching Marin over the rims of his glasses. And when she described the basement apartment and the stairs along the side of the building, he tilted his head ever so slightly, like a man committing the dosage of a medicine to memory. Then the door behind him opened. Bertie was guided past by 2 people. Marin's coat still wrapped around her feet. She had taken only a few steps when she stopped, turned toward the room, and pulled her arms free from those supporting her. She walked forward, slowly but with unmistakable purpose, and took Marin's hand between both of hers. "The girl brought me home," she said, looking directly at Teddy. It was raining, and she took off her own coat. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Teddy closed the notebook. She told Marin to hand over her driver's license. Marin did. One of the guards photographed both the front and back with his telephone, then returned it. "You may leave," Teddy said. "Your vehicle is outside. You should get back before 6 o'clock. Marin walked out, her legs trembling so badly that she had to steady herself against the doorframe. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and needed a long moment before she could shift into gear. In the rearview mirror, the iron gate had already slid shut, and the man with the spectacles was still standing in the doorway of the guardhouse, watching the van until it disappeared completely around the bend. Marin returned to the depot at 5:51, 9 minutes ahead of the deadline, and she knew something was wrong the moment she saw the light on inside the dispatch office. No one on the night shift ever turned on that light. The night shift meant returning the keys to the wooden box and going home, while the manager arrived at 7 o'clock. But that morning, Dale Pryor was already sitting behind the desk with his coat still draped over his shoulders, and on the computer screen in front of him was a black and white image Marin recognized at once. The lobby of the Ashcroft building viewed from above, the 2 plastic chairs, the cleaning cart, and 2 women. He didn't invite her to sit. 412. He tapped one finger against the screen. "You opened the main entrance. You allowed someone without an access card into the client lobby. You let that person remain there for nearly 20 minutes. Then you left the building, abandoned the 9th and 10th floors, and took the company vehicle somewhere for 58 minutes. Marin opened her mouth to speak. She was lost. It was raining. She had no shoes. And she was sick, Mr. Pryor. She was confused. If I'd left her standing outside, she could have died." "I know," Dale said. And what left Marin frozen wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them. Tired, without anger, almost with pity. "I watched all of it. I've been watching since 5:30 this morning, when building management called me. I know you didn't steal anything. I know you didn't open the door for a burglar. That isn't the issue." He turned the screen back toward himself. "Ashcroft has 4 law firms and an investment fund on those floors. Our contract with them contains a clause, a secure access clause. No one without an access card is allowed through that door after closing hours. No exceptions. No humanitarian circumstances. Nothing. You signed that agreement, Marin. Last March. Your signature is on page 4. He took out a document that had already been printed and pushed it across the desk. "They fined us this morning. The amount is $18,000, and they're considering whether to renew the contract in September. That contract keeps 22 people on my payroll." Marin looked at the paper. She didn't pick it up. "I'll pay it," she said, and the moment the words left her mouth, she knew how absurd they sounded. "You can take it from my wages, however much you need. I can work extra shifts." Dale didn't answer. He only pushed the paper a little farther toward her. Then Marin looked down at the words printed across the lower half of the page, the part she hadn't read at first, and understood that this wouldn't end here. Under the reason for termination, he hadn't written abandonment of duty. He had written violation of security protocol, followed by a code number. "You're putting this in my record?" Her voice was barely audible. "I have to." Dale removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "The client demanded it in writing. If I call it abandonment of duty, they'll audit us again next month and cancel the entire contract. I'm sorry. I truly am, Marin." She stood there and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. There were 12 companies in the city that provided cleaning services for commercial buildings, and all 12 searched the same database before hiring anyone. A notation like that didn't mean losing one job. It meant losing an entire profession. It meant that 3.5 years spent washing windows, scrubbing corridors, and pushing a cart through dark hallways at 3 o'clock in the morning could all be erased by a 4-digit code, simply because she had placed a key into a lock at 4:12 in the morning. She signed the paper. Her signature was a crooked scrawl that looked nothing like the signature on page 4 of the agreement. She returned the van keys and her access card. And when Dale asked whether she needed him to call a taxi, she said no. She walked outside. Morning had fully arrived. The rain had stopped at some point, and the eastern sky was the gray color of dishwater. Marin sat down on the concrete step outside the depot, resting both hands on her knees. A garbage truck passed at the end of the street. Across the road, Someone raised the metal shutter of a storefront. The city was waking up to go to work, and for nearly 30 seconds, Maren couldn't think of anything at all. Then she took out her telephone. She opened the banking application, signed in, and looked at the number on the bottom line. It wasn't her balance. Her balance was $211. The line beneath it was the one she opened once a month on the 4th day, and it said that she still owed $41,230 in medical bills, 4 years of treatment, 3 hospital admissions, a rented bed at home, boxes of medication the insurance company wouldn't cover because they weren't on its approved list. She had sold Ruth Ann's car, sold Ruth Ann's wedding ring because Ruth Ann herself had told her to sell it, and she still owed that much. Maren stared at the number for a long time. She wondered how she would pay next month's rent. She wondered what she would write in the employment history section of her next application. She thought of the old woman named Bertie, of those ice-cold feet, and of what Bertie had said to the woman with her hair tied low in that room beneath the white light, that the girl had taken off her coat. Then Maren realized something strange. Even if someone could rewind the entire previous night and place her once more before those glass doors, she would still open them. She would open them immediately, without hesitating for even a second. Perhaps that was the worst part of all. Maren switched off her telephone and placed it face down on her lap. She waited for the tears to come. They didn't. They hadn't come since a Tuesday morning 10 months earlier, when she had hurried home with a carton of milk still in her hand and found the room just a little quieter than usual. And from that morning onward, her eyes had remained dry, stubbornly dry, through the funeral, through the meeting with the hospital, and now on these concrete steps. She sat there for another 15 minutes, until the sunlight reached her. Then she stood, brushed off her trousers, and walked toward the bus stop. Maren opened the door, because she had stood behind it long enough to understand that the man outside wasn't going to leave. She pulled the iron door open no more than the width of her hand, keeping one foot braced behind it, and the light from the side stairwell spilled in so brightly that she had to narrow her eyes. He was taller than she had imagined when she first saw him through the crack. He wore no tie. The top button of his shirt was open, and his hands remained in his pockets. 3 steps behind him and slightly to one side stood the woman with her hair tied low, the same woman from the room beneath the white light. Maren recognized her immediately. She said nothing. The man didn't offer a greeting either. The first thing he said to her wasn't "thank you. You had 24 hours to call me and ask for money." His voice was deep and unhurried, never rising, the voice of a man who had never needed to speak loudly in order to be heard. "My security staff photographed your driver's license at 5:40 yesterday morning. 31 hours have passed since then. You know where we are. You know who we are. You didn't call. Why?" Maren tightened her grip on the door handle. "Call who, sir?" "Anyone in that house. A lawyer. The newspapers. People always call. Miss Quill. In 11 years, everyone who has ever come into contact with my family has called within 48 hours, and they always already had a number in mind." He tilted his head slightly. "You didn't. I want to know why." "Because I didn't think about it," she answered truthfully. "I was busy thinking about something else. Losing your job." Maren fell silent. He knew. Of course he knew. "The Ashcroft building fined Brightline $18,000. Your manager dismissed you at 6 o'clock yesterday morning and entered code 4902 into your employment record. That code bars you from the other 11 companies in the city." He removed one hand from his pocket. In it was a thick white envelope, with nothing written on the outside. He held it through the opening in the door. "Take it." Maren looked at the envelope. She owed $41,230. She had $211 in her account. Her rent was due in 10 days. She looked at the envelope longer than she wished to admit. Then she shook her head. "I can't take it. You're unemployed. Yes. You'll lose this room within a month." "Probably. Then why?" And Maren heard herself say something she hadn't managed to put into words until that very moment. "Because if I take it, then what happened that night becomes a transaction," she said. "Right now, it's still only the story of me opening a door for an old woman standing in the rain. That's all I have left. I lost my job. I lost my whole profession. If I take your money, then I lose that too. And after that, I truly won't have anything at all." The woman standing behind him shifted her weight slightly onto her other foot. The man didn't move. He withdrew the envelope, folded it in half, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat as casually as though the matter were hardly worth mentioning. My name is August Vreeland, he said. That was my mother. I'm Marin. I know. He fell silent again, and Marin had the distinct feeling that he was reading her from head to toe, slowly and without attempting to hide it. You were with my mother for 2 hours and 30 minutes, he continued. During those 2 hours and 30 minutes, you had a telephone in your pocket, and you stood exactly 4 steps from an emergency call station. Why didn't you call the police? Because she asked me not to. Do you do everything people tell you? No. Marin lifted her eyes and looked directly into his face for the first time. It was because I knew that look. When I mentioned the police, she grabbed my arm, and she was afraid in a very particular way. She wasn't afraid of being arrested. She was afraid someone would put her away somewhere and lock the door. I lived with that look every day for 4 years. I recognized it the moment I saw it. Something very small changed in August Vreeland's face. It wasn't an expression. It was more like something inside him had stopped for a single beat before beginning again. He didn't ask what those 4 years had been. He didn't ask who she had lived through them with. He simply stood there in the damp basement hallway in his polished leather shoes, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was lower now, and slower still. I need you to listen carefully, Miss Quill, because you have a right to know what you stepped into, he said. The outer door of my house can't be opened by hand. It requires a code. My mother can't remember her own telephone number. She can't remember 6 digits. In the past 14 months, she hasn't left the house once without someone accompanying her. Not because we keep her imprisoned, but because she can't open that door by herself. He paused. The night before last, that door was left unlocked. Marin felt the skin on her scalp turn cold. No one took her, August said. No one touched her. No one forced her. And I need you to understand that clearly. She simply pushed the door, and it opened, and she walked down the hill in the rain because she believed she was going to work and she was afraid of being late. But someone inside my house left that door unlocked, and that person knew exactly where she would go. Because whenever she wanders, there is only one place she ever tries to reach: the dress shop on Halbrook Street, the shop that closed in 1977. Marin opened her mouth, then closed it again. Someone was waiting for her there, he said. She never reached it. Somewhere in the city, she made a wrong turn and wandered nearly 1¼ miles east, and by 4 o'clock in the morning, she was knocking on the glass doors of the Ashcroft building. My people searched the entire Halbrook district all night. Other people were searching in exactly the same place. He looked at her. You brought my mother home before they found her. You had no idea what you had just disrupted, and you still don't know whose path you stepped between. Water moved through the pipes behind the wall. Marin could hear it with startling clarity. What am I supposed to do now? She asked, and her voice was no longer as steady as it had been before. For now, nothing, August said. Perhaps nothing will happen at all. Perhaps no one saw the license plate on your van. I hope that's true. He stepped back. Beside the door to Marin's room was a small window ledge, a dusty strip of concrete where she had placed a pot of withered basil, and it stood level with his hand. He set a card on it. It was made of metal, dull gray, with no logo and no name, only a sequence of numbers engraved into its surface. This isn't a gift, he said. I'm not buying anything from you. You made that clear. But if there ever comes a day when you notice someone standing at the end of this street longer than they should, don't run, don't call the police, and don't stop to think. Call that number. It will ring once. August Vreeland turned away. The woman with her hair tied low waited until he had climbed the entire stairway before following him. Marin remained in the doorway, staring at the metal card resting in the dust on the window ledge, and didn't reach out to touch it. It took Marin 4 days to understand that code 4902 was even more effective than an official ban. She applied at 6 places. 3 never called her back. 2 called, then went silent after receiving the verification report from the system. The 6th was a man who spoke kindly to her for 8 full minutes, asked whether she could work nights, asked whether she knew how to operate a floor scrubber, then stopped in the middle of a sentence and said in a completely different voice that he would be in touch. He never was. By the 5th day, she stopped applying to companies and began walking. She went along the rows of streets on the south side, stepping into every shop, every small clinic, every warehouse with a help wanted sign in the window, and asking the person behind the counter directly whether they needed anyone to clean at night. Holloway Private Clinic occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on Kell Street. between a laundromat and a locksmith's shop. The manager was a woman of about 50, named Dorothy, with reddish-brown dyed hair, who spoke quickly and never looked directly at anyone for more than 3 seconds. She asked Marin exactly 3 questions: whether she could work from 10 o'clock at night until 4 o'clock in the morning, whether medical waste bothered her, and whether she was willing to be paid in cash each week. She didn't ask where Marin had worked before. She didn't turn on a computer. The pay was $2 an hour less than her old job, with no insurance, no paid leave, and no contract beyond a handwritten sheet recording her hours. Marin accepted on the spot and began that same night. She started counting again from the beginning. Rent was $490, due on the 15th. Bus fare was $2 each way, 4 rides a day, and she cut it down to 2 by walking home. She ate noodles and eggs and bought milk from the discount store at the end of the street on Thursday evenings, when items nearing expiration were marked with yellow stickers. Every evening before work, she sat on the edge of her bed with a small notebook and wrote down every dollar she had spent that day, a habit she had formed during her 2nd year caring for Ruth Ann and had never been able to break. The number 41,230 was written on the final page of the notebook, and she never turned to it. On the 2nd morning after taking the job, she came home a little after 4 o'clock, unlocked the door to her room, and saw the hallway light spilling across the dusty window ledge. The metal card was still lying exactly where he had left it, tilted slightly, one corner resting against the rim of the pot where the basil had dried to death. Marin looked at it for several seconds. Then she picked it up. She told herself she was only clearing the window ledge, that leaving something like that exposed in a shared hallway was foolish, that she would throw it into the trash can at the bottom of the stairs when she went back out. It was heavier than she expected, cold, with edges polished smooth. She turned it over. There was nothing on the back, only the row of numbers engraved into the front, with no name. She carried it into the room, stood in the middle of the apartment for a while, then slipped it into the back pocket of the jeans she was wearing, the same jeans she wore to work every day. After that, she took a shower, went to bed, and by the time she woke the following afternoon, she had forgotten what she had done with it. The 3rd night was when she saw the car. Holloway Clinic had a long window stretching across the entire front of the building, and while cleaning the glass from inside, a person could look directly onto the opposite sidewalk. On the 1st night, Marin hadn't noticed anything. On the 2nd, it briefly occurred to her that the dark sedan parked at an angle beneath the tree might belong to someone in the neighboring building. On the 3rd night, as she drew her cloth across the glass a little after 1 o'clock in the morning, she realized it was parked in exactly the same place, precisely half a car length from the tree, its front pointed toward the main road, and a small orange light inside the cabin flickered once before going dark. Someone was sitting inside. Marin didn't stop moving. She finished wiping the pane at the same steady pace, circled behind the reception desk as she did every night, and only when she was hidden from the view of the street did she stand still and let out her breath. She didn't call anyone. She didn't go outside to look. She thought of the telephone number engraved on the metal card and pushed the thought away, because calling it would mean admitting that something was happening, and as long as she didn't call, everything could still be nothing more than a car parked there overnight. At 4 o'clock, when her shift ended, she didn't leave through the front entrance as usual. She turned off the reception lights 3 minutes earlier than she normally did, carried her bag down the rear corridor, and went out through the delivery door that opened into the alley between the clinic and the locksmith's shop, then circled back onto Kell Street from the opposite end. She walked home by a completely different route, nearly 2/3 of a mile longer, passing through the wholesale market just as its lights were beginning to come on. She didn't look back once. When she reached home, she locked the door, wedged the chair beneath the handle as she always did, then sat on the edge of the bed and took out her notebook to record the day's expenses. Her hands didn't tremble at all. That was what she would remember forever about those 3 days, how calm she had been, and how terribly wrong she had been to believe that changing the road home would be enough. On the 4th night, the sedan was no longer parked beneath the tree across the street, and Marin allowed herself to believe that it was over. She worked the shift as usual. At 2 o'clock in the morning, she was cleaning the corridor that connected the reception area to the 3 examination rooms farther inside, drawing the floor squeegee across the tiles in steady strokes, one earbud in her ear playing the overnight news, though she couldn't absorb a single word. The bell above the glass door gave one brief chime. She assumed Dorothy had come back for something. Then she heard footsteps, 3 people moving quickly, and out of rhythm, and a man's voice rang out from the reception desk, louder than necessary, inside an empty building. "Peter Ames." Marin stopped moving. "Peter Ames's file. It came in Saturday night. Get it out." She stepped from the corridor just as one of them reached across the counter and swept an entire stack of papers onto the floor. There were 3 men in heavy coats, with one standing directly in front of the glass door to block it. The man in the middle turned and looked at her. "Do you work here?" "I only clean," Marin said. "I don't have the key to the filing cabinet. I'm not allowed to touch it. Then open that computer. I don't have the password." The man took 2 steps toward her, and Marin stepped back, and the floor squeegee caught against her foot. He reached out to drag her toward the counter. She twisted her shoulder away, lost her balance on the wet tiles, and fell, one hip striking the edge of the cleaning cart. The water bucket overturned, spilling across the corridor floor. She heard him say something above her, then heard the glass door chime a second time. Marin looked up. 2 men had just walked in. They wore dark suits without ties, their bare hands resting loosely at their sides. They didn't say a word. They didn't draw anything from beneath their clothes. They simply walked 3 steps into the middle of the reception area and stopped, one positioning himself at an angle in front of the glass door, the other blocking the entrance to the corridor, and they stood there in silence with their arms hanging at their sides. The atmosphere in the room changed completely. Marin saw the exact moment it happened on the faces of the other 3 men, the moment their aggression drained away in less than 2 seconds, like water emptying from a basin. The man who had tried to grab her took half a step back. He glanced toward the man guarding the door. Neither side said anything. Then all 3 began retreating without turning their backs, moving backward until they reached the glass door and slipped outside. The sound of their running footsteps faded along the sidewalk and disappeared. Marin remained seated on the floor in the middle of the spilled water, one hand braced beneath her, pain throbbing sharply through her hip. The man standing near the corridor turned and looked at her. He didn't ask whether she was hurt. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He only watched her for exactly 2 seconds, his gaze flat and empty, then turned and followed the other man outside. The glass door closed. The bell gave one brief chime. The clinic became quiet again, with only the low hum of the vaccine refrigerator behind the counter. Marin stayed where she was for nearly a minute. Then she stood, righted the bucket, and began pushing the water away. She cleaned the entire corridor, gathered every sheet of paper from the floor and stacked them neatly on the counter, and completed every remaining task of that night's shift. Throughout those 2 hours, her mind circled around only one thought. Those 2 men hadn't happened to be passing by. They had entered exactly 2 minutes later. That meant they had already been outside. It meant they had been out there all night, and perhaps on the nights before as well. Marin leaned the floor squeegee against the wall and stared through the clinic's front window, at the empty sidewalk across the street, and the tree beneath which no car was now parked. Someone was guarding her. She understood that, and it should have made her feel safe. But then came the second thought, and the second thought sent a chill down her spine. People only guarded something when they knew someone else was trying to take it. She had been seen, not by one side, but by both. And she still had no idea who Peter Ames was. The laundromat on Kell Street stayed open around the clock, and never had an attendant, only a coin change machine mounted on the wall, and a plastic sign reminding customers to turn off the lights when leaving after 11 o'clock at night. Marin arrived there shortly before 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, her only day off that week, carrying a bag of laundry and 7 coins she had counted in advance and placed in her coat pocket. She put her clothes into dryer number 3 because the first machine didn't turn evenly, sat down on the plastic chair beneath the window, and opened the book she had borrowed from the neighborhood library branch. She was alone in the laundromat. The dryers turned with a steady rhythm, warm and drowsy, the only sound Marin had found comforting in the past 2 weeks. The doorbell chimed. She didn't look up, but from the corner of her eye, she registered 2 figures. Registered that neither of them carried a laundry bag, and registered that they weren't walking toward the coin machine. They came straight down the center aisle between the 2 rows of machines, directly toward her. Marin closed her book and stood. The man in front was thin, nearly a head taller than she was, with a hollow, pale face and hair clipped close to his scalp. The man behind him was shorter and heavier, and he stopped 3 steps away, standing directly in the middle of the aisle to block it. Both wore thick cloth coats, though the day wasn't cold enough to require them. Marin Quill. The thin man spoke her name. She didn't answer. She looked toward the front door. He shifted just enough to cut off that direction. "We only want to ask you a few questions," he said. His voice was hoarse and level, without any rise or fall. "On the night of the 18th, you drove a van from downtown to the northern hills. There was an old woman in the vehicle." Something dropped inside Marin's chest. She kept her face unchanged. "I don't know what you're talking about." 52 minutes, he continued, as though she hadn't spoken at all. "You sat beside her for 52 minutes, inside a closed vehicle. We don't care who you are. We don't care what you do. We only want to know one thing." He leaned toward her. "What did the old woman say in the van?" Marin felt the pulse beating in her throat. Without being summoned, Bertie's voice returned inside her mind, low and strangely clear in the dim glow of the dashboard, speaking about a fabric cellar and the 4th floorboard from the eastern wall. "She didn't say anything," Marin said. "She asked me what time it was, over and over. She thought she was late for work. What else? Then she fell asleep." The thin man studied her for a long time. "You're a poor liar." "I'm not lying," Marin said, and she could hear the trembling in her voice and hated it. She was confused. "Do you understand what that means? She couldn't even remember my name. She called me by someone else's name the entire way." The man behind him spoke for the first time, his voice higher and impatient. "Tell her we know where she lives. They said you sleep in a basement, didn't they?" The air inside the laundromat seemed to freeze. Marin stood perfectly still, and for nearly 3 seconds, she could no longer hear the dryers turning. She slept in a basement. She had said those words only once in her life. Not to Dorothy. Not to Dale Pryor, who had only the address written on her documents, number 28 Fenmore Street, with no mention of a basement. She had said them inside a square room beneath a white ceiling light, when a woman with her hair tied low had asked where she lived, and Marin had answered because she was afraid. The basement room, the stairs along the side of the building, no doorbell. There had been 4 people in that room. The thin man spun around and glared at the one who had spoken. It was only a glance, brief and furious. Yet that glance told Marin that she had heard correctly, that the words had slipped out by mistake, and that somewhere behind these 2 men was a door she had just seen open a crack. She had no time to think any further. The thin man turned back and seized her wrist. It wasn't a threatening grip. His hand clamped down and pulled, dragging her shoulder forward, and she understood that within 15 seconds she would be outside on the sidewalk, inside some vehicle, and no one would ever see her again. Marin didn't scream. In this neighborhood, no one came running when they heard a scream. People only locked their doors more securely. Her left hand had been inside her coat pocket from the moment the 2 men entered the laundromat, and inside that pocket was something she had carried throughout her 3.5 years of cleaning work, a small plastic spray bottle filled with concentrated cleaning solution, the kind she used to remove stains from ceramic tile. She pulled it out and sprayed it directly into the face of the man holding her wrist, twice in succession, from less than a hand's breadth away. He released her immediately and reeled backward, both hands covering his face, the sound coming from his throat no longer forming words. Marin turned. The laundromat's metal-framed laundry cart stood beside her, heavy and rolling on smooth wheels. She planted both hands against its side and shoved it with all her strength toward the second man as he rushed forward. The iron frame struck him across the shins. His knees buckled, he stumbled over the cart itself, and he fell against the row of washing machines on the left. Marin didn't wait to see whether he could stand again. She abandoned her bag of clothes, left the book on the chair, and ran toward the back of the laundromat, where a metal door fitted with a push bar opened into the alley behind the building. She heard footsteps behind her. She heard a voice calling her name. Then she heard an explosion. It sounded nothing like it did in films. It was dry, flat, and so loud that for one instant her ears contained nothing but a long, piercing ring. Directly to her right, the round glass door of dryer number 6 burst apart, and tiny fragments shot across the aisle, and one of them sliced across her forehead. Though at that moment she felt nothing at all. Marin threw her entire body against the push bar. The door flew open. She lunged into the alley, afternoon light striking her eyes, the smell of garbage bins and cooking grease drifting from the restaurant next door, the concrete slick beneath the soles of her shoes. She ran. She ran the length of the alley, turned left at the exit, crossed the parking lot of a home goods store, slipped between 2 delivery trucks, and reached the avenue. There were people there. Car horns sounded. A group of pedestrians waited for the light at the crosswalk, and a woman pushed a shopping cart away from the supermarket. Marin merged into the crowd, lowering her head and thrusting both hands into her pockets to conceal how violently they were trembling. And she walked. She walked for 4 straight blocks, neither quickly nor slowly, without looking back even once. By the 4th block, Marin's legs had begun to stop obeying her. She turned off the avenue onto a narrower side street, and midway down the row of buildings stood a grocery store that had been closed for years, its metal shutter pulled down, its storefront covered in faded flyers, and in front of the entrance was a recess, nearly 3 feet deep, wide enough for one person to stand inside and remain hidden from anyone looking across from the opposite sidewalk. She stepped into it, leaned her back against the corrugated metal shutter, and for the first time since the steel door had burst open, she stood still. Her body betrayed her at once. Her knees softened, and she had to slide down until she was crouched on the concrete step. Her breaths came in short mouthfuls that never seemed deep enough. She raised a hand to her forehead, and when she drew it away, there was blood on her fingertips, a thin streak already beginning to dry, and she stared at it with genuine surprise because she couldn't remember being injured at all. She dug her telephone out of her coat pocket. It slipped from her hand and struck the concrete step, and when she bent to pick it up, she saw her own hand trembling, strangely and independently, as though it no longer belonged to her. She had to hold the telephone between both palms just to keep from dropping it again. Her thumb moved toward the keypad. 3 numbers. That was what a normal person would do. That was what every posted instruction, every handbook, and every lesson at school had taught people to do. Someone had just fired a gun inside a laundromat at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A patrol car would come. Someone would take her statement. Someone would hand her a cup of water and tell her to sit down. Her thumb stopped above the number pad. They said you sleep in a basement. The sentence returned to her mind intact, and with it came the square room beneath the white light and the 4 people standing inside. The woman with her hair tied low holding the notebook, the 2 guards, and the older man with his glasses resting low on the bridge of his nose, carrying the leather bag, standing in the doorway without asking a single question, tilting his head only slightly when she mentioned the stairs along the side of the building. 4 people. All 4 belonged to the Vreeland household, and 20 days later, a man she had never seen before stood in the middle of a laundromat and repeated that detail. Marin sat inside the recessed doorway and tried to force her thoughts into order through the trembling of her own body. If the information had left that room, then it had passed through the hands of at least one person August Vreeland trusted. And if there was already a door inside his own house that someone could open, what assurance did she have that there wasn't another door just like it inside the police station? She was an unemployed woman whose work record carried a security violation, with no lawyer, no relatives, and no one who would call to ask questions if she disappeared for 3 days. She would sit in another room under another white light and tell everything she knew to people she knew nothing about, and among them there might be someone who would pick up a telephone the moment she walked out the door. Ruth Ann had once taught her something when she was 14, and had only just moved in, that when you don't know whom to trust, you don't choose the person who speaks most convincingly, you choose the person who has the most to lose if you die. Marin lowered the telephone onto her lap. She reached into the back pocket of her jeans. Her fingers touched something thin, hard, and cold. She pulled it out and looked at it resting in her palm. The gray metal card with no name, no logo, and a row of numbers engraved into its surface. She had slipped it into that pocket on the night she found it, and had forgotten all about it. It had remained there for 2 weeks, accompanying her through every night shift at Holloway Clinic, riding the bus with her, lying beneath her each time she sat on the edge of her bed to record her expenses. Marin stared at it for a long time. Then she entered the numbers one by one, slowly, because her hands still hadn't steadied. The telephone rang exactly once. Location. A woman's voice, cold, flat, without a single unnecessary word. She didn't ask who was calling. "I'm Marin Quill," she said. "I'm on." She looked up at the street sign on the corner, Dunmore Street, outside the closed grocery store, near the intersection with the avenue. 2 men came looking for me at the laundromat. One of them had a gun. There was a silence lasting exactly 2 beats. "Are you bleeding?" My forehead. "Not much. Stay out of sight from the street. Don't call anyone else. Don't go anywhere." The line went dead. Marin lowered the telephone. She pulled the hood of her coat over her head and pressed herself into the deepest corner of the recessed doorway, where the metal shutter cast a patch of shadow, and she counted her breaths because it was the only thing she still had control over. A bus passed. A man walked by with a dog and didn't glance inside. At the end of the street, a police siren rose briefly, then faded in the direction of Kell Street, and Marin listened to it with a strange feeling that was almost regret. The feeling of someone who had just closed with her own hand, a door she had believed all her life would always remain open. 3 minutes later, the vehicle arrived. It didn't roar its engine. It didn't brake sharply. A black sport utility vehicle, separated from the moving traffic, glided to the curb directly in front of the recessed doorway, and stopped so smoothly that if Marin hadn't been staring straight at it, she might have believed it had been parked there all along. The rear door opened from the inside. Marin climbed inside and pulled the door shut behind her, and the city disappeared. The windows were tinted so dark that from inside she could see only patches of color drifting past, while the noise beyond them was cut off as though someone had turned down the volume of the entire world. The rear compartment smelled of leather and something dry and clean that she couldn't name. Teddy Kane sat in the front passenger seat without turning around. Beside Marin, in the darkness between the two windows, August Vreeland sat with one hand resting on his thigh, slowly turning the ring on his little finger beneath the pad of his thumb. He didn't ask whether she was all right. His eyes went directly to the cut on her forehead before she had even finished releasing her first breath. What caused that cut? The glass door of a dryer shattered, Marin said. I don't know when it happened. August took a cloth handkerchief from the breast pocket of his coat and held it out to her. She accepted it and pressed it against her forehead, and the scent of clean fabric made her feel irrationally sick. At some point, without her noticing, the vehicle had begun to move. 2 men, he said, not as a question. Yes. One was thin and tall, with his hair cut close. The other was shorter and heavier. What did they ask? They wanted to know what your mother said in the van. Marin saw Teddy Kane tilt her head slightly in the front seat. August didn't move at all. What did you tell them? I told them she only asked me what time it was. A silence followed. Was that the truth? Marin opened her mouth, then stopped. Bertie's voice returned inside her mind, speaking in the dim glow of the dashboard about the fabric cellar, the 4th floorboard, and the numbers. She was too tired to deal with anything else. She said a lot of confused things, she answered. Old stories, things from decades ago. August didn't press her. Later, Marin would return to that exact moment many times. Was there anything else? He asked. She told him about the words that had slipped out. She repeated them exactly, and she described the brief glance the thin man had thrown at the one who spoke. Then she told him that she had said those words only once in her life, inside a room beneath a white light, in front of 4 people. August's hand stopped turning the ring. No one in the vehicle spoke for a long stretch of road. In the front seat, Marin saw Teddy Kane take out her telephone, type a few words, then put it away. At last August spoke, his voice as calm as it had been from the beginning, and it was that very calmness that made Marin feel cold. You were right not to call the police, he said. But everything has changed now, and I'm going to tell you what has already been done, not what will be offered. She looked up. Your belongings from the room on Fenmore Street were completely packed by 5 o'clock this afternoon. Nothing was thrown away. 2 boxes, which is exactly how much you owned. Your landlord was paid the remainder of your lease plus 2 additional months, and he signed the termination papers. Holloway Clinic had someone covering the night shift this morning, and Dorothy was informed that you had a family emergency. She didn't ask any further questions. Marin sat motionless. Everything has been ready for 3 days, August said. I was only waiting for you to call. Something rose into her throat, and it took her a moment to realize that it wasn't fear. It was anger, arriving so quickly and burning so hot that even she was startled by it. You didn't ask me a single question, she said. No. You packed my belongings. You ended my lease. You called my employer and told them I had a family emergency when I don't even have a family. Her voice rose, and she didn't try to restrain it. Do you know the last time anyone asked me what I wanted? I don't. I can't remember. When I was 6 years old, someone came to collect me from school, and by the time I reached the house, all my things were already waiting on the porch inside a black plastic bag. No one told me where I was going. Then it happened again when I was 9. Again when I was 11. 7 times, Mr. Vreeland. 7 times people packed my things and moved me somewhere else, and not once did anyone sit down and ask me a single question. She pressed the cloth tightly against her forehead. I'm not afraid of you. I'm only tired of always being the last person to learn what is happening to my own life. The vehicle passed beneath a stretch of streetlights, and the light swept across August Vreeland's face before darkness covered it again. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, he neither raised his voice nor apologized. "If I had asked, you would have said no," he said. "You've already said no to me once, at the door to your room, when I offered you something you desperately needed. If I had called you this afternoon and asked whether you wanted to leave that room, you would have told me you still had a shift tonight. Then you would have gone to work, and tomorrow morning, I would have had to send someone to collect your body from somewhere in this city." Marin turned and looked at him. "I've done that 4 times in my life," August said. 4 people. I remember every one of their names. I warned 3 of them beforehand, and all 3 told me they could take care of themselves, and I respected their answers because I believed what you believe, that people have the right to decide what happens to their own lives." He turned his head and looked directly into her eyes for the first time. "I don't intend to do it a 5th time, Miss Quill. You may remain angry with me for as long as you like. I would rather have you sitting inside my vehicle, furious with me, than stand there while someone closes the zipper on a bag." Marin couldn't speak. She turned away and looked into the dark window beside her, where only the faint reflection of her own face stared back. The anger was still there, whole and undiminished, but beneath it, something else had begun to take shape, and that frightened and confused her far more. In 28 years, this was the first time anyone had moved her belongings, because they didn't want her to disappear from that place. "Where are we going now?" she asked, her voice quieter. "To my house," August said. "My mother has asked about you 3 times this past week. She doesn't remember your name. She only remembers that someone took off her coat." This time, the iron gate began to open while the vehicle was still nearly 66 feet away, and Marin realized she was holding her breath as they passed through it. The sport utility vehicle continued for almost another minute along the gravel drive before the house came into view, and she understood why she had seen only 3 illuminated windows from outside the gate that night. An older woman met her in the entrance hall, Mrs. Santos, who spoke English slowly and in short sentences, and led her to the 2nd floor by a staircase whose dark wooden banister had been polished smooth, where countless hands had rested over the years. She opened a door and stepped aside. Marin walked in and stopped in the middle of the room. It was larger than her entire former apartment, and not by a small amount. A large bed stood against the center of one wall. An armchair sat beside the window. Another door opened into a private bathroom, and 2 bottles of water had been placed on a small table. In the corner, arranged neatly beside each other, were 2 cardboard boxes sealed with tape, and on their lids someone had written in square, careful letters with a marker, "Kitchen things, personal things, Mrs." Santos asked whether she needed anything to eat. Marin said no, and thanked her. When the door closed, she remained still for a long while, then walked over to the 2 boxes, sat down on the floor, and opened the first one. Her expense notebook was lying on top, enclosed inside a clear plastic bag. Beneath it were the tin box containing her photographs, the library book she hadn't managed to return, and Ruth Ann's gray sweater, which Marin had kept even though it was 2 sizes too large for her. Nothing had been thrown away. Someone had carefully slipped the notebook into a plastic bag before placing it in the box, and that small detail left Marin sitting motionless for a long time with both hands resting on the lid. That night, she couldn't sleep in the bed. The mattress was so soft that when she lay down, her body sank into it with nothing firm to resist her, and the bed was too wide, and she lay in the middle of an enormous emptiness inside an enormous room, and every time she began to drift off, she startled awake because there wasn't a wall close enough to reach. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, she pulled the blanket and 1 pillow onto the floor, spread them in the narrow space between the side of the bed and the wall with the window, lay on her side facing the wall, and fell asleep immediately. The next morning, she woke before Mrs. Santos, folded the blanket, placed it neatly on the bed, and said nothing to anyone. At noon that day, she saw Bertie again. The old woman was sitting in the sunroom in the southern wing, a light blanket spread across her knees, with a tray of food in front of her that had barely been touched. Bertie looked up, and there wasn't the slightest spark of recognition in her eyes. Marin had expected that. She pulled a chair closer and sat beside her, not too near, keeping herself at the old woman's eye level, and she didn't ask whether Bertie remembered her. She said the weather was beautiful that day. Bertie didn't ask who she was. She only studied Marin for a moment, then remarked that in sunlight like this, Bed sheets would dry very quickly, and Maren agreed that they certainly would. From that day forward, Maren began spending a little longer in the sunroom each afternoon, and she didn't ask anyone's permission. On the second day, she noticed that shortly before 4 o'clock, when the sun dropped low enough to meet the line of trees outside, the light slanted through the windows and cast long, narrow shadows across the inner wall, and at precisely that hour Bertie would grow restless, her fingers repeatedly smoothing the edge of the blanket while her eyes moved toward the door. On the third afternoon, when the clock read 3:45, Maren stood, closed the curtains, switched on the 2 table lamps at opposite ends of the room, and said nothing. 4 o'clock passed quietly. Then, 4:30, Bertie sat folding a handkerchief, opening and folding the same piece of cloth again and again, perfectly calm. On the 4th afternoon, Bertie turned toward her and asked when her husband would be home, because he had promised to return before dinner. The daytime caregiver, who was standing at the medicine table behind them, drew in a small breath and prepared to say something. Maren raised one hand to the level of her waist, a small gesture, and the woman stopped. "I haven't seen him today," Maren said, her voice as ordinary as though she were speaking about the weather. "But tell me about your wedding. What did you wear that day?" And Bertie told her. She spoke for 20 minutes about the neckline she had sewn herself, about the rain that began just as they were taking the photographs, and about a friend who stepped on the hem of her gown on the church steps. She laughed 3 times. She didn't ask about her husband again that afternoon. By the end of the week, the daytime caregiver wrote in the observation log kept beside the bed that during the previous 4 days, the patient's episodes of afternoon agitation had fallen from an average of 3 each day to none at all, and that she had eaten her entire dinner on all 4 evenings. Beneath that, she added one brief sentence stating that the only change in the patient's routine was the presence of one additional person sitting with her in the afternoons. That logbook was placed on August Vreeland's desk on Sunday evening. He read it twice. Then he closed it and sat for a long time in the darkened room, turning his father's ring around his little finger. At 2 o'clock in the morning, August walked along the second-floor hallway carrying his shoes in one hand, following a habit he hadn't been able to break in 11 years, and he stopped when he saw a strip of light beneath his mother's door. The door stood open by about the width of a hand. Inside, the table lamp in the far corner had been turned toward the wall, so that its light reflected indirectly across the ceiling instead of shining onto the bed. Bertie was asleep, one cheek pressed into the pillow, her breathing steady. And sitting in the armchair that had been pulled close to the bedside was Maren, her legs drawn up, an open book resting on her lap, her left hand lying lightly against the edge of the old woman's blanket, not holding it, only touching it. She wasn't reading. Her eyes were lowered to the page, but they had remained fixed there for a long time. August stood outside the door. He didn't go in. He remained there for nearly 7 minutes, and during those 7 minutes he didn't think about the harbor or the calls he still hadn't returned. He thought instead about something very small and strangely unreasonable, that the armchair had originally stood beside the window, and someone had dragged it across the entire room alone in the middle of the night, so that it would rest in exactly the place a person waking at 3 o'clock in the morning would see first. He went downstairs to the kitchen. Half an hour later, Maren came down as well, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw him sitting there with a glass of water, with only the light above the sink turned on. She started to turn away. "Sit down," he said. She sat at the far end of the table. He didn't ask what she had been doing in his mother's room at 2 o'clock in the morning. He only studied her for a moment, then asked a single word. "Why?" Maren understood the question. She turned the empty glass slowly against the wooden tabletop. "Her name was Ruth Ann Vance," she said. "She was my 7th foster home. I went to live with her when I was 14, and I had already calculated in my head that I would probably stay about a year and a half, because that was the average for each home. She didn't ask many questions. She only cleared out a room for me and said, 'Put your things wherever you want. This is your room.' I stayed there until I was 24. She paused. Then she began to forget. How old was she? 68. At first she only misplaced her keys. Then she left the kettle on the stove. I was in my 2nd year of nursing school. I thought I could study and care for her at the same time, and I managed for 1 more semester. Then she wandered away for the first time, and they found her 4 blocks from home at 11 o'clock at night, and the next day I went to school and filed for a leave of absence," Maren continued, her voice even, almost like someone reading from an inventory. 4 years. I sold her car in the 1st year. I sold the china cabinet in the second. In the third year, I sold her wedding ring, and she was the one who told me to do it. She was clear all morning that day, and she held my hand and said, "Sell it, sweetheart. I don't need it anymore. I need you to be able to sleep." By the fourth year, I was working 2 jobs, staying with her during the day and cleaning at night. And I slept 3 hours. She looked up at him for the first time. In those 4 years, I never left her alone in the house for more than 10 minutes. Not once. I timed everything. I counted the journey there and back. She lowered her eyes. That Tuesday morning, we were out of milk. I went to the store at the end of the street. Normally it took 9 minutes there and back. That day, a truck was blocking the entrance, so I had to go around, and the store was crowded, and altogether I was gone for 24 minutes. The kitchen was very quiet. When I came home, she was already gone, Maren said. She hadn't wandered away. She was still lying in bed. They told me it was her heart, that it could have happened at any time, and that being there wouldn't have changed anything. I know they were right. I'm half-trained as a nurse. I understand it rationally. She tightened her hands around the empty glass. For 4 years, I left her alone exactly 15 minutes longer than usual, and it turned out those were the only 15 minutes that mattered. August said nothing. He didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. He simply sat there, and Maren was more grateful to him for that than she could have been for anything he might have said. Then she drew in a breath and tried to pull the air in the kitchen toward something lighter, because she had spent her whole life learning how to do that. "Your mother was like that too," she said, offering a faint smile. "That night in the van, she told me all kinds of stories. There was one part I never forgot because she told it so well. She described the fabric cellar beneath the dress shop. She said it was damp and full of rats, and no one ever bothered to go down there. Then she said there was a floorboard, the 4th one from the eastern wall. She said to count inward from the wall, and that board wasn't nailed down. It only rested there. Then she said there were ledgers underneath it, numbers, and that she had written them in her own code, using her mother's birthday as the base, and adding the clothing measurements of every person. She even laughed. She said no one ever thought a wife knew how to count." August shot to his feet. His chair scraped in a long, harsh line across the tile. Maren stopped speaking. He stood there with one hand braced against the table, and he remained silent for so long that she could hear the refrigerator humming in the corner and the wind moving through the trees outside. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone dry. "Repeat every word exactly as she said it." Maren did. She spoke slowly, and she repeated the part about the 4th floorboard and the eastern wall twice, and she watched his face grow paler with every sentence. "I thought she was confused," she said. "An old story from an old woman. Anyone who cares for someone with memory loss hears things like that all the time. My mother wasn't confused about that part," August said. He reached for his telephone. "My father died when I was 29. He was shot in his own parking lot, and 3 months before it happened, he gave me a name and told me that if anything happened to him, the only thing keeping this entire family standing was a ledger, and he didn't know where it was. He searched for it for 11 years. I searched for another 5. A man named Raymond Hulse searched for it for 6 years, and he killed people because of it." He looked down at her. 17 people have died because of that ledger in 16 years, Miss Quill. 17. I know every one of their names by heart, and my mother told you where it was inside a van, while crossing the city, between 2 questions about what time it was. Teddy Kane arrived within 9 minutes. They spoke for less than 2 minutes in the entrance hall. Then a car door closed and the taillights disappeared around the bend. Maren didn't return upstairs. She remained in the kitchen with August, and neither of them said another word, while outside the darkness began fading into the palest shade of gray. At 4:11, the telephone vibrated. August put the call on speaker. Teddy's voice carried clearly through the empty kitchen. "The old dress shop is now used as storage by a furniture store. The cellar is still intact. I counted from the eastern wall." There was a pause. "The 4th floorboard has already been pried up, sir. It was placed back where it belonged, but the edge is chipped, and there's fresh sawdust beneath the floor. There was a tin box underneath." Another pause. "The box is empty. The dust inside has been disturbed. I would estimate a few days, no more than a week." August ended the call. He placed the telephone on the table, sat down, and began turning his father's ring around his little finger, slowly and steadily, one circle after another. Maren barely dared to breathe. Have you told anyone else about that floorboard? He asked. No one. I thought it didn't mean anything. At the laundromat, they asked what the old woman had said in the van. Yes. That means they didn't know, August said slowly. It means that as of that day, they still had to ask. He stopped turning the ring, but someone had already taken the box before then. He sat motionless for a long time, staring at some point on the wooden tabletop. Then he spoke, and his voice was so quiet that Marin couldn't tell whether he was speaking to her or to himself. 4 people heard you give your address in that room. 4, no more. He raised his eyes toward the window, where the eastern sky was slowly growing brighter, and 3 of those 4 people are sleeping inside this house. The following night, Marin couldn't sleep either. She went down to the kitchen shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning to get some water, and she was standing at the sink when she heard the garage door burst open, not opening normally but being shoved so hard that it struck the wall, followed immediately by the sound of someone's feet dragging across the tile. Teddy Kane came in first, one arm hooked beneath the shoulder of a young man, nearly carrying him rather than helping him walk. Teddy's coat had been left somewhere outside. The sleeves of her shirt were rolled to her elbows, and the young man's right trouser leg was dark from his thigh all the way down to his ankle. He was trying to walk, and he couldn't. August appeared in the kitchen doorway at the same moment Marin turned around. Put him on the table, Teddy said. They lifted him onto the thick wooden kitchen table in the center of the room. Marin saw his face beneath the ceiling light and immediately realized that he was very young, no older than 25, with brown hair and lips that had already gone pale. He didn't cry out. He only breathed in quick, shallow gasps, his eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. Who is he? She asked. Peter Ames, Teddy said. 23. Marin froze for exactly half a second, because she had heard that name once before, inside a clinic at 2 o'clock in the morning, spoken by a man who was sweeping medical records onto the floor. Where's Osgood? August asked. I called him. He's downtown. Teddy glanced at the clock. Part of the hill road has been washed out since this afternoon. He has to take the eastern route. 25 minutes, no faster. Marin looked down at the young man's leg. Someone had tied a strip of cloth around his thigh. But it was too low, close to the knee, and it was soaked through with blood and had begun to loosen. Above the binding, the fabric of his trousers swelled and darkened with every beat. She understood immediately what was happening, and she understood that 25 minutes was time Peter Ames didn't have. She didn't ask anyone's permission. Pull him toward the head of the table, quickly, she said, and her voice changed completely, louder and flatter, a voice she herself hadn't heard in a long time. Stand on the other side and keep this leg straight. Don't let it bend, mister. Vreeland, press both of his shoulders against the table and hold him there. He's going to struggle. You mustn't let go. August stepped forward and did exactly as she said, without asking a single question. Marin took the bread knife from the rack, cut the trouser leg lengthwise from the knee to the groin, and peeled the fabric aside. She saw what she needed to see. She didn't stop to think. She tore the badly placed cloth from his leg and threw it onto the floor, and everything became worse at once, and Peter Ames arched off the table, and August forced him back down. Marin leaned her entire body forward, planted the heel of her right hand at the precise point in the crease of his groin, placed her left hand over it, locked both elbows straight, and drove the full weight of her body down through her arms. She felt the pulse beneath her palm, hard and rapid, then slowly weakening under the pressure. I need a belt, she said without looking up. Thick, wide leather, not cloth, and the handle of a wooden spoon, the hardest one in this kitchen. Hurry. Mrs. Santos had appeared in the doorway at some point, and she ran to find them. Teddy immediately removed her own belt. The wooden spoon handle was placed in Marin's hand about 20 seconds later. Slide the belt beneath his thigh, about 1 hand's width above my hand, close to the groin. That's right. Fasten it. Tighter. Make it tighter, Marin said. Now slide the spoon handle between the belt and his skin, beside the buckle. She still didn't lift her hands. Turn the handle. Keep turning. Turn it again. Don't stop when he cries out. Teddy twisted it. The belt tightened 1 turn at a time, biting deeply into his thigh. Peter Ames released a long groan through clenched teeth, and August held both shoulders against the table without moving. Marin counted silently in her mind. 1, 2, 3, and on the 4th turn she felt the flow beneath her palm change, and she slowly lifted her hand by no more than the width of one finger joint. The blood no longer spurted. It only seeped, slowly and steadily. "Stop. Don't turn it any farther," she said. "Secure the spoon handle so it can't unwind. Use anything." August pulled the necktie from the pocket of the coat draped over a chair and handed it to Teddy. Maren looked at the clock on the wall. From the moment she pressed her hands down until the blood stopped spurting, 40 seconds had passed. She stepped back half a pace, and only then did she realize how badly both her arms hurt. She placed 2 fingers against Peter Ames's neck. His pulse was fast and weak, but it was there. She lifted one of his eyelids. She took off her coat and laid it across his chest. "He'll drift in and out, so don't let him sit up," she told Teddy. "If he starts shaking, cover him with something else. Don't give him anything to drink. When the doctor arrives, tell him the tourniquet was applied at 2:19. He'll need the exact time." Teddy Kane looked at her. She said nothing. She only nodded once, briefly and decisively. In the 2 weeks Maren had spent in that house, it was the first gesture the woman had ever offered her. Osgood arrived 22 minutes later. He entered the kitchen, carrying his leather bag, looked at the young man on the table, looked at the belt and the wooden spoon handle, then looked at Maren leaning against the wall in the corner of the room, and said nothing except to tell everyone to move aside. Maren walked to the sink. She turned on the faucet and stood watching the water run for a long time before placing her hands beneath it. Both hands were red beyond the wrists, and dark, dried streaks marked her elbows and the insides of her forearms. She scrubbed them beneath the stream, and the water in the basin changed color, then slowly cleared, then clouded again as she continued washing. She heard someone stop behind her. August took a clean towel from the rack, held it beneath the running water, then wrung it out. He took her right forearm, turned it outward, and began to wipe it clean. He worked from her elbow downward, slowly and carefully, cleaning the places she couldn't see. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't thank her. He didn't ask where she had learned to do that, because he already knew. Maren stood still and allowed him to continue. She looked down at her hands, at the fingertips cracked from 3.5 years of working with chemicals, and saw that they were trembling very slightly, only now beginning to tremble, when everything was already over. August moved to her other arm. The water continued to run. Neither of them turned it off, and neither of them said a word, and they remained that way for a long time beside the sink in the brightly lit kitchen, until Osgood called from across the room for Teddy to bring another lamp closer. The following afternoon, Bertie became restless early, nearly 2 hours earlier than usual, her hands repeatedly smoothing the edge of the blanket, while her eyes kept moving toward the door, and Maren understood that the house had been noisier than normal the previous night, and that people who were ill always sensed the things no one told them. She closed the curtains at 3 o'clock, switched on both table lamps, then went to the cabinet beneath the stairs and took out a cardboard box Mrs. Santos had shown her the day before, a box containing 4 photograph albums with loosened bindings and a stack of loose pictures tucked between the pages. She placed it on the floor of the sunroom, sat beside Bertie's chair, and told her she had no idea how to arrange everything neatly and needed Bertie's help. That was the only approach that worked. She didn't ask whether Bertie wanted to do something. She asked Bertie to help her with something. Bertie straightened in her chair at once. They worked that way for an hour. Maren held up each photograph. Bertie studied it, then placed it into one of 3 piles, according to a logic only she understood, and she changed her mind about that logic 3 times, and not once did Maren point out that she had arranged things differently only moments before. When they reached the 3rd album, Maren opened the stiff cover and tilted it gently so the loose photographs would slide free from the sticky, transparent pages. And one picture fell into her lap with its back facing upward. It was smaller than the others, with scalloped edges and paper that had yellowed with age. On the back, written in blue ink in the rounded handwriting of a young woman, were the words, "Spring of 1974. Maren turned it over. 2 young women stood in front of a glass door painted with an arch of lettering, of which Maren could make out only part, dress shop, and below it a street number and the word Halbrook. Both women wore light coats. Their arms were linked. Both were laughing with the kind of laughter that came when someone took a photograph in the middle of an unfinished story. The woman on the left was Bertie. Maren recognized her immediately from the small chin and the way she tilted her head slightly to one side. The woman on the right was a little taller, her hair tied in a ponytail, one hand holding the front of her coat against the wind. Maren looked at the photograph. Then she looked at it longer. Then she carried it closer to the window where the light was stronger, and her hands began to grow cold. She knew that mouth. She knew the way one corner lifted higher than the other when she smiled. She had seen that expression every day for 14 years on a face 40 years older. Seated in the armchair beside the kitchen window of a small house on the southern side of the city, Ruth Ann Vance, Maren sat down on the floor. She remained there for a long time, holding the photograph in both hands while everything inside her mind fell out of order. Ruth Ann had never said she had once worked as a seamstress. Ruth Ann had never mentioned Halbrook Street, never spoken the name of a single friend from her youth, and never told any story from before 1977, the year she moved into that small house and began working as a cashier at a pharmacy. There hadn't been a single photograph of Ruth Ann as a young woman anywhere in the house. Maren had asked once, when she was 16, and Ruth Ann had only said that she hadn't liked having her picture taken in those days, then stood and went to wash the dishes, and Maren had been wise enough not to ask a second time. 49 years of silence. And now that woman stood before her in her 20s, arm linked with someone Maren had found in the rain inside the Ashcroft lobby at 4 o'clock in the morning. "Ma'am," Maren said, and she had to clear her throat once. "Please look at this for me." She held out the photograph. Bertie took it. She looked at it, and something passed across her face, very quickly. "Ruthie," she said. Maren stopped breathing. "Ruthie had the finest hand stitching in the shop," Bertie said, her eyes still fixed on the picture. "Mrs. Halloran always gave her the necklines. I was better with numbers." She gave a quiet laugh. "The girl was so frightened. I told her, 'You go now. You have nothing to do with this. You leave, and you never come back. Don't write. Don't telephone. Don't mention my name to anyone.'" Her finger touched the face of the woman on the right side of the photograph. "She listened to me. That was the only time she ever listened to me." Maren remained motionless on the floor and felt the entire 28 years of her life rearrange themselves into a different order. Ruth Ann had left because Bertie told her to leave. Ruth Ann had remained silent for 49 years because Bertie told her to remain silent. And 49 years later, the girl Ruth Ann had taken into her home, the girl she had taught to answer the same question 3 times as though hearing it for the first time, to close the curtains before the shadows grew long, to place a cup of tea into someone's hand at exactly the right angle. That same girl had stopped at 4 o'clock in the morning before a glass door because she recognized that look. She recognized it because Bertie had sent Ruth Ann away from this city. There was nothing divine about it. It was only a very long, straight line that no one could see until it finally closed. August entered the sunroom shortly before 5 o'clock. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Maren sitting on the floor beside the open box, her face drained of color. She looked up, handed him the photograph, and said in the most ordinary voice she could gather that the woman on the right was Ruth Ann Vance, the woman who had raised her from the age of 14. August took the photograph. He studied it for a long time, and Maren saw his jaw move once. Then Bertie spoke. "You're the girl who brought me home," she said. Maren turned sharply toward her. The old woman was looking directly at her, her eyes clear, without the slightest trace of confusion. "It was raining. You took off your coat and wrapped it around my feet. You drove a large white vehicle that smelled of bleach," Bertie said, pronouncing every word clearly. "I do remember. I can't remember for long, but right now, I remember." Maren couldn't speak. Bertie turned toward her son. Her voice remained as calm as when she spoke about the neckline of a dress. "Don't let the girl leave, August." Tuesday morning was so clear that from the sunroom they could see the southern horizon distinctly, and August entered at 9 o'clock carrying 2 cups of coffee, placed one on the table beside his mother, then pulled over a chair and sat at her eye level, exactly as he had watched Maren do for the past 2 weeks. Maren started to rise and leave. He gave a slight shake of his head, and she remained seated. He didn't ask his question immediately. He spoke to his mother about the coffee, about the line of trees outside, about the fact that there was no wind that day. Then, in the same gentle voice, he said that the other day she had told Maren about the cellar beneath the dress shop. Bertie looked up, and for the next 5 minutes, the person sitting in that armchair was no longer the old woman whose curtains Maren closed each afternoon at 4 o'clock. Her back straightened, her hands stopped smoothing the edge of the blanket, and came to rest neatly one over the other. "You're looking for the ledger," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I've been looking for it for 15 years. Your father looked too." Bertie's mouth lifted faintly at one corner. He searched inside his own house and never knew. He held it in his hands 3 times. I know. You told me. He said it looked like a fabric record. She laughed, brief and sharp, the same laugh Maren had heard in the van. It was a fabric record. Yards of fabric. Fabric widths, delivery dates, customers' names. Except the customers' names weren't customers' names, and the number of yards wasn't the number of yards. August set down his coffee. How long did you keep it? 10 years, she said. From 1972 to 1982. Once a week. Every Thursday night after the shop closed. No one knew except me. She looked at her son. Did you think I spent 10 years doing nothing but sewing wedding gowns? Maren sat motionless in the corner and felt the skin on her scalp grow cold. Mother, August said very slowly, someone has taken the box from beneath the floorboard. The ledger is in someone else's hands now. He waited for a reaction. None came. Bertie only shrugged. Let them have it, she said. They can't read it, son. I wrote it so no one could read it. Not even your father. She lifted her coffee, blew gently across the surface, and took a sip. The base is my mother's birthday, but she was born in Cork, and the birth certificate has the wrong date. So the real base isn't the date written on the paper. It's the date she always claimed was hers. Then you reverse the final 2 numbers. Then you add the clothing measurements. But I took those measurements from the shop's fitting book, not the real figures, and the shop's fitting book burned in 1983. She set down the cup. Without me, it's only a fabric ledger. That's all. The room fell silent. Maren looked toward August and saw that his face had gone white, and she understood it at the same moment he did. For 16 years, 17 people had died because of a ledger, but the ledger had never been the valuable thing. The valuable thing was the mind that had created it. And that mind was sitting in an armchair in the sunroom, losing a little more of itself with every passing day, with no way to stop it. Raymond Hulse didn't need the ledger. He already had it, and it was useless in his hands. He needed her. He had needed her from the beginning, and on the night of the 18th, when someone left the outer door unlocked, that person hadn't intended for Bertie to wander away. That person had intended to deliver her to a meeting place. August rose so quickly that his coffee spilled across the table. He left the room, and Maren heard him call Teddy's name in the hallway. She stood and wiped up the coffee, and Bertie had already turned back toward the window, and when Maren asked whether she would like another cup, she said there was no wind today, and the bedsheets would take forever to dry. The woman from 1974 was gone. The afternoon passed with a strange normality. At 3 o'clock, Maren carried a basket of partly folded towels into the sunroom, and the 2 of them sat folding, something Bertie could do for hours without tiring, folding each towel in half, then into quarters, smoothing it flat, and placing it on the stack. Outside, the sky remained clear. Somewhere behind the house, a lawnmower was running. Then the lawnmower stopped. Maren wouldn't notice that detail until later. Teddy Kane appeared in the doorway. She didn't enter, and one hand was already braced against the frame. To the basement. Now. Maren asked no questions. She stood, placed the basket of towels on the floor, and helped Bertie to her feet with both hands. Let's go somewhere else for a little while. There's a heavy storm coming. Bertie allowed Maren to guide her. They had barely reached the middle of the hallway when the explosion came. It wasn't like the gunshot in the laundromat. It came from the direction of the main gate, low and heavy, and the floor trembled beneath their feet, followed immediately by the sound of glass. The entire row of tall windows lining the hallway shattered inward at once. A dry, prolonged crash, and Teddy Kane turned, forced both women against the inner wall, and covered them with her body, her back facing the windows. Maren heard shards striking the back of Teddy's shirt. "Run," Teddy said when the noise subsided. "Don't stop." They ran. Maren wrapped one arm around Bertie's waist and nearly lifted her from the floor, and the old woman managed to run in short, quick steps, without making a sound. At the end of the hallway, behind the library stairs, stood a wooden door that looked like the entrance to a storage closet. Teddy opened it. Inside was a concrete staircase leading downward. "The code for the door below," she said to Maren. "Did the boss tell you to memorize it?" "I remember." "Close it and don't open it for anyone except me or him," Teddy said, then turned away, and Maren had only enough time to see the red spreading across the back of her shirt before the wooden door closed. At the bottom of the stairs was a steel door. Marin entered 6 numbers. It opened, and when it closed behind them, 3 heavy bolts slid into the frame, and every sound from the world above disappeared. The room was small, with bare concrete walls, a folding bed, 2 bottles of water, and a row of monitors mounted on the wall. Marin helped Bertie sit on the bed. The old woman looked around, and Marin saw her hands begin smoothing the edge of her blouse. "Where are we?" "This is the storm shelter," Marin said, sitting close beside her until their shoulders touched. "The wind is very strong outside. We'll sit here for a little while until it passes." Bertie nodded, but her hands continued to move. Something struck the ceiling above them, distant and muffled, and she looked up. Marin took hold of her hand. "The other day, you told me about your wedding, but you didn't finish the story," she said in an ordinary, unhurried voice. "You reached the part where it began to rain during the photographs, and then you stopped. What about the dress? Did you make it yourself?" Bertie turned toward her. "Of course I made it myself," she said. "But Mrs. Halloran wouldn't let me use fabric from the shop, so I had to buy it somewhere else, and I hardly had any money." She began to tell the story. She spoke about the width of the fabric, about joining the bodice with a line of stitches hidden beneath a fold, about shoes so tight that she had to take them off and walk barefoot across the grass. Her hand stopped smoothing the edge of her blouse. She had been talking for about 4 minutes when she laughed, and Marin laughed with her, while above their heads the house was breaking apart piece by piece. Marin lifted her eyes toward the row of monitors. 7 of the 8 screens had turned to white static. The remaining one showed a high-angle view of the main hall in grainy black and white. She saw smoke. She saw 2 people run through the frame. Then she saw August. He emerged from the western hallway, stopped in the middle of the entrance hall, and turned his head toward the door. A flash appeared at the edge of the screen. August dropped onto one knee, then fell sideways to the left, one hand gripping the base of the staircase, and he didn't rise again. Marin didn't cry out. She couldn't. Beside her, Bertie was still talking about the tight shoes, and Marin's hand was still resting inside hers, and she gave it the gentlest squeeze, and she heard her own voice ask another question about those shoes in the calmest tone she had ever heard herself use. No one knew how much time had passed before 3 knocks sounded against the steel door, followed by Teddy Kane's voice through the intercom, hoarse but still flat, telling Marin to open it. Marin stood. She turned back toward Bertie, who was sitting on the folding bed, and told her that she needed to go upstairs for a little while and asked whether Bertie could finish folding these towels for her, then placed in her lap the stack Mrs. Santos had long ago stored in the safe room for moments like this. Bertie accepted them and began to fold. Marin entered the code, stepped outside, and closed the door behind her. Above them, the house no longer looked like a house. The hallway was covered in shattered glass. A section of plaster ceiling had collapsed across the passage, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of broken mortar. Water from the fire suppression system was still pouring somewhere in the western wing, flowing in streams along the corridor and spilling down the steps into the courtyard. Teddy stood at the foot of the stairs, her left hand pressed against her right shoulder, her face gray. "East wing," she said. "Medical room. Go." They had carried August there 10 minutes earlier. The room had been built for emergency treatment, with a steel table, an overhead surgical lamp, 2 glass cabinets filled with supplies, and a monitor no one in the house knew how to operate properly except Osgood. August lay on the table, his shirt cut away, while 2 men pressed gauze against the lower left side of his abdomen. One glance was enough for Marin to understand. A penetrating wound, the entry point low in the abdomen and the exit wound in his back, and the amount of blood collected across the table told her what was happening inside him, even though she couldn't see it. "Where's Osgood?" she asked. "We haven't reached him," Teddy said. "The hospital?" 40 minutes. Both ends of the hill road are blocked," Teddy said, looking directly at Marin. "Tell me whether 40 minutes is possible." Marin looked down at the steel table, at the blood already gathered in the drainage groove along its edge, and said no. August opened his eyes. He found her, and he said nothing. He only looked at her. Marin removed her coat, threw it onto a chair, and went to the sink. "Go outside and tell them to bring every flashlight in this house, handheld ones, and have 2 people stand on either side of the table holding them," she said, her hands already beneath the running water. "Open both glass cabinets. I need gauze, hemostatic clamps, sutures, needles, and every bag or bottle of saline left in the house. Is there morphine?" 2 ampules in the locked cabinet. Osgood has the key. Then break the cabinet. She put on gloves. She told the two men, pressing the gauze, to step back, looked into the wound, and needed about 15 seconds to understand what she would have to do, and to understand that she had never done it before. She had completed 2 years of nursing school. She had assisted in the training room 11 times. She had never placed her hands inside the abdomen of a living person. She bent until her face was level with August's. "Can you hear me?" He nodded, barely. "I have 2 ampules of morphine. They'll make this bearable, but they aren't anesthesia, and I don't have anesthesia," she said. "That means you'll remain awake, and you'll feel everything. It will hurt badly. I won't lie to you about that." August breathed out through clenched teeth. "Do it." Later, Maren would never remember the next 40 minutes as one continuous sequence. She would remember only fragments. She remembered Teddy counting the gauze pads aloud every time she handed one over, because Maren had told her to count and say each number out loud so that none would be left inside his abdomen when they finished. She remembered the 2 beams of light trembling slightly with the breathing of the people holding them, and she shouted once, only once, telling them to stand still. She remembered her own voice counting the rhythm, steady and without rising or falling. 1, 2, 3, clamp. 1, 2, 3, gauze. The same voice she had heard senior nurses use in the training room and had once believed was cold. And now she understood that it wasn't cold at all. That it was the only thing keeping everyone in that room from breaking apart. She remembered August gripping the edge of the steel table until his knuckles turned white and never making a sound, and at one point he managed to say 2 words, "Keep going." And she kept going. She remembered finding the source of the bleeding and clamping it, and for the next 3 seconds she didn't breathe. At around the 30th minute, while she was irrigating the abdominal cavity with the 4th bottle of saline, footsteps sounded in the hallway. The door opened. Neville Osgood stood in the doorway with his leather bag in one hand and his coat draped over the other arm. He looked at the scene inside the room and said that he was there, that the road had been blocked and he had been forced to take another route, and that he would take over now. Maren didn't look up. She didn't stop what she was doing. She was holding a clamp, and she never took her eyes from it. "Your bag is dry," she said. No one in the room moved. The courtyard outside is flooded ankle deep with water from the fire system. "I just walked through it. My shoes are wet all the way to the cuffs of my trousers." She extended one hand, and Teddy placed a gauze pad into it, and Maren said, 1, 2, 3, while Teddy counted the gauze aloud. "Where have you been standing for the past 2 hours, doctor?" Osgood didn't answer. That was what Maren would remember most clearly about that moment, that he had enough time to say something, anything at all, and he said nothing. Teddy Kane turned her head and looked at him. Then she placed the box of gauze down, called a name through the doorway, and 2 men entered. No one raised their voice. Nothing was broken. The leather bag was taken from Osgood's hand and placed on a chair, and he was escorted from the room, and the door closed, and all that remained inside was the sound of saline flowing and Teddy reading out the count. Maren never looked up once throughout the entire exchange. She still had 10 minutes of work left. She closed the inner layer, then the outer one, and the final stitch was stitch number 21, a number she remembered because she counted those too. She placed the gauze, secured the dressing, and told Teddy to raise the foot end of the table. She checked his pulse, fast, but steadier than before. She looked up at the monitor, which someone had finally managed to switch on, then stepped back from the steel table. Only then did her hands begin to shake. They trembled so violently that she had to clench them into fists and press them against her stomach, and she stood that way with her back against the glass cabinet and her eyes closed for about 15 seconds. No one in the room spoke. Then she opened her eyes, removed the gloves, and told Teddy that they had to call the hospital now, that what she had done had bought them only a few hours and wasn't a cure, and that there was an old woman sitting in the basement folding towels who had probably finished every last one by now. At dawn, when the sky outside had faded to a pale gray and the final water pump had at last fallen silent, Bertie entered the code and opened the steel door herself. No one knew where or how she had remembered those 6 numbers, and afterward no one asked. She climbed the concrete stairs one step at a time, crossed the hallway covered in shattered glass without once looking down at her feet, and walked directly toward the eastern wing as though someone were guiding her. In the medical room, the surgical lamp had been switched off, leaving only the small green light on the monitor blinking steadily. August lay on the steel table, breathing evenly beneath a thin blanket. And on the floor beside him, her back resting against one of the table legs, her head lowered onto one arm stretched across the edge of the table, sat Marin. She had fallen asleep there without realizing it, still wearing her wet clothes, with dark, dried stains along her sleeves and fingertips wrinkled from water and antiseptic. Bertie stood and watched them for a while. She didn't understand what had happened inside this house. She didn't know why broken glass covered the floor, didn't know why her son was lying on a steel table, and she wouldn't remember this scene the following day. But she saw a girl sleeping upright on a cold floor. And that was something she understood immediately, without anyone needing to explain it. She walked to the chair in the corner, picked up the blanket draped across its back, carried it over, and opened it with trembling hands, before laying it across Marin's shoulders and pulling it down to cover her entire back. Marin woke and raised her head, her eyes still struggling to focus. "Why did you come up here?" "You rest," Bertie said, placing one hand on the girl's head and leaving it there. "Let me keep watch." Then she pulled the chair closer to the steel table, sat down with both hands folded in her lap, and kept watch over them for more than an hour, her back straight, silent, her eyes facing the door. The woman who had been rescued on a rainy night had returned to guard the sleep of the person who had saved her, and neither of them understood that the circle had just closed. August regained consciousness around noon. The ambulance had arrived at 7 o'clock that morning, but he had refused to leave, and a doctor from the private hospital remained at the house, changing the intravenous fluids and saying that the sutures were remarkably clean, that whoever had placed them had known exactly what she was doing. Teddy Kane entered the room shortly before 1 o'clock in the afternoon with one shoulder completely bandaged, and she said only that the matter with Raymond Hulse had ended at dawn and that no one would be coming to the house again. She offered no further explanation, and August didn't ask, and neither did Marin. When the two of them were alone, August told her to open the second drawer of the desk against the wall, the locked one, and said the key was beneath the base of the lamp. Marin opened it. Inside wasn't the thick white envelope she had imagined during the previous 3 seconds. It was a thin set of documents, carefully bound, with a notary's seal in the corner. She read the first page, then the second, then stood there for a long time with the papers in her hands. 3 weeks earlier, through a financial company she had never heard of, her entire medical debt of $41,230 had been purchased. It hadn't been paid on her behalf. It had been purchased. That meant that for the past 3 weeks, the person to whom she owed money was no longer the hospital. It was August Freeland. She had eaten at the same table with him, slept beneath his roof, and placed her hands inside his abdomen to stop him from bleeding, all without knowing. "You owned me for 3 weeks, Marin said, her voice trembling with anger. 3 entire weeks, and you didn't say a word to me." August didn't defend himself. He didn't say that he had done it to protect her, didn't say that he had intended to tell her later, didn't offer any excuse at all. He only held out his hand. Marin placed the documents into it. He took them and, using the arm he could still move, tore them in half in front of her, then let both pieces fall to the floor. "Now you don't owe anyone anything," he said. "Not them, and not me." Then he told her about Vermont, a small town, a 1-story house with a backyard, enough money for her to complete the remaining 3 years of school without working nights, and a clean employment record with no code attached to it. No one there knew her name. No one there knew she had ever sat inside this room. Marin stood beside the window and allowed herself to imagine it as something real. Mist in the mornings, a small kitchen, a name no one ever called, long afternoons without anyone knocking at the door, and while she imagined it, she suddenly understood something that sent a chill down her spine. She didn't need to imagine it at all, because she had already lived that exact life for 28 years. 7 houses that had never been hers. Night shifts inside empty office towers where she cleaned windows for people who would never know her face. A basement room with no doorbell. The quiet he was offering her wasn't freedom, it was invisibility. Only this time it had been freshly painted and came with a backyard. She reached into the back pocket of her jeans and took out the gray metal card. It had remained there through all those days, accompanying her through everything. She walked to the steel table and placed it on his chest. "I've spent my whole life cleaning up the things other people leave behind," she said. "I don't intend to leave anyone behind again." August looked at her for a long time. He didn't make a declaration of love, didn't promise her anything, didn't reach out and pull her closer. He only slowly opened the hand resting on the blanket, and in his palm lay a key. It wasn't the key to a safe. It wasn't a car key. It was the key to the front door. Maren took it, closed her fingers tightly around it, and sat down in the chair where Bertie had kept watch at dawn. 6 months later, on a September afternoon, Maren Quill finished her hospital training shift at 4 o'clock, went directly to her evening class, and returned home shortly before 11 o'clock at night with a stack of textbooks in her bag. She still slept 4 hours a day. She still had 2.5 years left before earning the degree she had abandoned at the age of 24. Nothing had become easy. The only difference was that now, when she opened the door and walked inside, a light had been left on for her in the kitchen, and a covered plate of food from Mrs. Santos was waiting on the table. On Sunday afternoons, she carried a basket of towels into the sunroom, as she did every week. Bertie sat in the armchair, folding each towel in half, then into quarters, smoothing it flat, and placing it on the stack, while softly singing an old song from 1974, whose name she couldn't remember, and whose origin she no longer knew. Maren sat beside her, picked up a towel, and sang along. She didn't know the words. She only hummed with the melody, missing a few notes, and Bertie never corrected her. Some people pass through nearly their entire lives without anyone truly seeing them, until the day they stop for someone else who has also been forgotten in the rain. True kindness places no conditions and asks for no reward. But sometimes, long afterward, it still finds its way back to the person who gave it. Because the most precious thing one human being can offer another isn't money, and it isn't power, but this simple promise: I see you, and you don't have to walk alone. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone you believe may need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that more moving and heartwarming stories can reach you every day. How do you feel about Maren's final choice? And if you had been in her place, would you have opened that door? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.